The last charge went off just after 4 in the afternoon, and when the smoke cleared, every man in that tunnel stopped talking. They had been cutting into the ridge for 11 weeks. 11 weeks of black powder and hand drills and standing in cold water up to their ankles, because in that part of Tennessee the rock is limestone, and limestone holds water the way a sponge holds it. Every foot they cut, the water came in behind them. They pumped it out by the bucket. They cursed it. They got used to it. So when the foreman climbed through the raw gap in the rock and pushed his lantern into the dark on the other side, the first thing he noticed was not the shape of the space, or the walls, or the strange even floor under his boots. The first thing he noticed was that it was dry, bone dry, not a drop, not a trickle, not even the damp breath you feel when you walk into a cave. A pocket of still, sealed air in the middle of a soaking wet mountain, and it had been sitting there, dry. I have to pause here for a second, because what I just described, that is one case from a much larger pattern. There are 35 documented cases in a document I put together. Different cities, different decades, different types of evidence. Every single one follows the same sequence: discovered, documented, acquired, disappeared. I could not fit all of it into a video. It's in the pinned comment below. Find it before we continue. For longer than any man standing in that tunnel could begin to account for. This is the story of what that crew found inside a Tennessee ridge in the summer of 1889. It is also the story of why you have almost certainly never heard of it, because the two questions are the same question. What was inside that ridge, and who decided that the rest of us would never be allowed to know? Stay with me, because by the end of this, the tidy version of how this country got built, the one you were taught, the one carved into every textbook and every bronze plaque, is going to look a lot less like history and a lot more like a story someone needed you to believe. Let me take you back to the world these men lived in, because you have to understand the world before you can understand why the world went so quiet about this. In the 1880s, the American South was being stitched back together with iron. The war had ended barely 20 years earlier, and the men with money in New York and London had discovered something in the mountains of Tennessee and Kentucky and Alabama: coal, iron ore, timber standing so thick and so old that a man could ride a full day and never leave the shade. And all of it was worthless where it sat, because there was no way to move it. A mountain of coal is just a mountain until you can put it on a train. So they built trains, or rather, they paid other men to build trains, and paid other men still to cut the paths those trains would run on. That is what this crew was doing. They worked for one of the small railroad concerns that fed the larger lines, the kind of company that existed for 3 or 4 years, laid its track, took its money, and dissolved into another company with a different name and the same investors behind it. The paperwork on these outfits is a maze, and I want you to remember that, because the maze is not an accident. Companies that leave almost no records are very convenient to have around when something happens that you would prefer left no record. And I want to be specific about how that money actually moved, because the shape of the money is the shape of the whole crime. A railroad in eastern Tennessee in 1889 was almost never one company. It was a nest of them. There was the operating line, the one whose name went on the timetables. Above it sat a holding concern that owned the operating line but built nothing and employed almost no one. Above that sat the men, a handful of them, sometimes in New York, sometimes across the ocean in London, who owned the holding concern through other concerns still, layers deep, so that if you tried to trace who actually gave the order to seal a tunnel, you would climb through 6 shell companies and arrive at a name on a piece of paper in a country you could not afford to reach. That structure was not built for efficiency, it was built for deniability. It was built so that when something had to disappear, the men who made it disappear were legally and physically impossible to find. Remember that architecture, because it is the same architecture that closes around the chamber in a few minutes, and it did not appear by chance the week the crew broke through. It was already in place. It was always in place. It was waiting, the same way the room was waiting. The official story of this era is a story you already know in your bones, even if you have never said it out loud. It goes like this. Brave, clever, self-made men looked at an empty wilderness, and through sheer grit and Yankee ingenuity, they carved a modern nation out of raw rock in a single generation. Nothing was here before them. They started from nothing. They built everything. It is a beautiful story. It is the story on the money. It is the story in the speeches. And I am going to spend the next 40 minutes showing you the cracks in it, starting with a dry room inside a wet mountain. The ridge they were cutting through sat in the eastern part of the state, in the folded country where the Cumberland Plateau breaks up into long, parallel spines of rock. If you have ever driven through there, you know the shape of it. The ridges run northeast to southwest, mile after mile, like the earth was raked by something enormous. The railroad wanted to go the other way, east to west, which meant they could not follow the valleys. They had to punch straight through the ridges, and that is expensive, and it is slow, and it kills men, so nobody does it unless the thing on the other side is worth more than the men it will cost to get there. The crew was maybe 40 strong at full count, Irish and German immigrants, freedmen who had come up out of the deeper south looking for wages, and a handful of local men who knew the rock. They were led by a foreman whose name comes down to us only in fragments, a man the others called Doyle in the few accounts that survive. Doyle had cut tunnels before. He knew wet rock. He knew the way limestone behaves, the way it will hold together for 100 feet and then let go all at once and bury a man before he can drop his tools and run. He was, by every scrap we have, a careful man. And careful men are the ones who notice when something is wrong. The rest of the men are mostly names without faces, or faces without names, the way working people always are in the records of things they were not supposed to survive. But a few come through. There was a powder man the others called Kettle, an older freedman who had learned his trade in the mines of the deeper south, and who could pack a charge that would break the rock exactly where he wanted it and nowhere else. There was a pair of German brothers who spoke little English and did the work of 4 men and sent almost every dollar home. There was a boy, no more than 16, who carried water and tools and messages, and whose job it was to run to the tunnel mouth and back, and who therefore saw more of who came and went than anyone. If any full account of that summer was ever going to survive, it would have come from a boy like that, the one nobody thought to watch, the one carrying the buckets. Hold on to him too. He matters later. These were not fools, and they were not children, apart from the one boy. And I say that because the easy way to dismiss what they found is to imagine them as ignorant men frightened of the dark. They were nothing of the kind. They were skilled labourers who spent their lives underground, who knew rock the way a sailor knows water, who had seen every ordinary strange thing a mountain can show you: caves, underground streams, fossils, veins of ore that glittered like treasure and were worthless, sinkholes that opened without warning. They were not men who spooked easily, because men who spook easily do not last a week in a tunnel. So when I tell you that this crew went quiet, that these particular hardened, experienced, unsentimental men stopped talking and stood still, I need you to understand that it takes a great deal to make men like that go silent. They had seen the inside of the earth, and the inside of the earth had never, until that afternoon, shown them anything it was not supposed to contain. For 11 weeks the work went the way tunnel work always went. Drill the face, pack the holes with powder, clear the men back, light it, wait, go back in through the smoke and the dust, and haul out the broken rock by the cartload, and start again, foot by foot, and every foot, the water. The deeper they went into the ridge, the more water they hit, which is exactly what you would expect, because the water table sits high in that country, and the limestone is riddled with old channels. They were, essentially, tunneling through a wet stone sponge. The pumps ran day and night. The men worked in a permanent cold drizzle that came from the rock itself. Then, in the 11th week, the drilling changed. The men working the face said the rock got harder, not the soft, wet, crumbling limestone they had been fighting. Something denser, something that rang differently when the steel bit into it. Doyle came up to look, and what he found, according to the accounts, was a seam in the rock that did not belong, a line, too straight, running vertically down the tunnel face where the natural stone had no business running straight at all. Now, a careful foreman sees a line like that, and he thinks about a fault, or a mineral vein, and he keeps working, so they kept working. They packed the holes, and they set the last charge of that day, and they lit it, and they went back through the smoke, and the wet limestone was gone. On the other side of that final blast was a wall, not a rock face, a wall. Fitted stone, laid in courses, the blocks so tightly joined that Doyle, holding his lantern up to it, could not fit the blade of his knife into the seam between them. And in the middle of that wall was an opening, because the blast had knocked out a section of it, and through the opening came air, dry air, still air, air that had not moved in a very, very long time. Here is where I need you to slow down with me, because everything that follows depends on you understanding one simple, physical, undeniable fact. That chamber should have been full of water. Think about where it was. Deep inside a limestone ridge, below the water table, in rock so saturated that the crew had been pumping it out for 11 straight weeks to keep from drowning. Every natural cavity in that kind of stone fills with water. That is not a theory. That is just what happens. Water finds the empty space and it takes it. A sealed chamber in wet limestone, left alone for decades, fills up. Left alone for centuries, it is a flooded tank. There is no mechanism, no natural process anyone has ever described, by which a hollow room stays dry inside a soaking mountain unless something is keeping the water out. Unless the room was built, and sealed, and waterproofed by hands that knew exactly what they were doing. And it was dry. Doyle put his lantern through the gap, and the flame did not gutter, and the floor was dry, and the walls were dry, and the air smelled, in the words that came down to us, like old stone and nothing else. No mould, no rot, no damp. Just the clean, patient dryness of a room that had been waiting. So what was in it? The accounts here are thinner than I would like, and I want to be honest with you about that, because the men who could have told us most were, as you will see, given very strong reasons to stop talking. But the pieces that survive line up in a way that is hard to explain and harder to forget. The chamber was not large, 20 feet or so across, they said, with a ceiling higher than a man could reach. The floor was flat, not smoothed rock. Flat, fitted stone, the same tight courses as the wall, laid so level that a dropped coin would not roll. The walls rose straight and met the ceiling in a clean line. And at the centre of the far wall, opposite the opening the blast had made, there was a recess, a niche cut into the stone and set into that niche, something the men could not name. They described it in the language they had, which was the language of tools and machines and the things a working man in 1889 knew. Some said it looked like a great disc of dark metal, taller than a man, set into the wall on its edge. Some said the surface of it was covered in fine lines and grooves, cut too even and too small to be anything a chisel had done. One account, and this is the one that has kept me up more nights than I will admit to, says that when Doyle brought his lantern close to it, the surface of the thing was not cold like the stone. It was faintly warm. In a sealed, dry room, inside a cold, wet mountain, there was one object that was warm to the touch, and no fire, no sun, no living thing anywhere near it to explain why. There is more, and the more is the part that the folklore version always sands down, because it is the part that is hardest to explain away. The floor, they said, was not blank. Set into the fitted stone were lines, fine channels, grooves cut into the surface in a pattern that ran out from the base of the niche toward the centre of the room and then branched, the way a river branches on a map, or the way the veins branch in a leaf, or the way, and this is the comparison one of the men reportedly made, the way the copper wires branched inside the new electrical apparatus that was just then beginning to appear in the cities. In 1889, in a mountain in Tennessee, working men who had barely seen an electric light in their lives looked at the floor of that chamber and reached, groping, for the only thing in their world that the pattern resembled, wiring, as if the room had been laid out to carry something from the object in the wall to somewhere else, as if the whole chamber were not a tomb or a vault, but a device, and the disc was only the part of it that had not yet been removed. And the object itself. Let me give you what survives, and let me be careful, because this is exactly where a storyteller is tempted to invent, and I would rather show you a smaller true thing than a large false one. The men agreed on a few points. It was dark, darker than iron, and it did not rust, which in that wet country was itself strange, because iron left underground for a season comes up red and flaking. It was set on its edge in the niche like a great coin stood upright. Its face was covered in the fine, even markings, lines, and small figures, cut or cast so precisely that no man there believed a human hand had done it with a chisel, and it was warm, not hot. Warm the way a stone is warm after the sun has been on it, except there had been no sun on this stone since before any of them were born, and there was no sun on it now, only the cold of a mountain that soaked every other surface in the tunnel with icy water. One warm object, in a dry room, in a cold, wet mountain, marked with a language nobody could read, wired into a floor that led nowhere anyone could follow. That is what 40 men saw. Now hold that image, and let me tell you what was done to make sure you would never see it yourself. Now, I know what a reasonable person does with a story like that. A reasonable person files it under tall tale, under the kind of thing tired, frightened, superstitious labourers dreamed up in the dark and repeated until they half believed it. And if this were the only story of its kind, I would file it there too. But it is not the only story of its kind. It is one of dozens. And that is the thread I want to pull, because when you pull it, the whole tidy blanket of official history starts to come apart in your hands. Before we get there, though, we have to talk about money, because this is not just a spooky story about a room in a mountain. This is a story about economics, about who paid for what, and who profited from what, and whose version of events got written down as the truth. And the money, once you start following it, tells you more than any lantern ever could. Let me ask you a question the textbooks never want you to ask. How, exactly, did a war-ravaged, broke, exhausted region go from rubble to a full industrial economy in roughly a single human lifetime? Think about the scale of it. Thousands of miles of railroad laid across some of the most brutal terrain on the continent, bridges, tunnels through solid rock, entire cities that seem to appear in the record almost fully formed, with waterworks and street grids and stone buildings, in places that a few years earlier the same records describe as wilderness. The standard answer is capital and labour and grit. Money came down from the north and from Europe. Men came from everywhere, and they built it all, fast, because they were driven and clever and hungry. But the timelines do not always work. And when the timelines do not work, you are being lied to about something. I have spent a lot of time with the construction records from this period, or rather with the ghosts of them, because so many are missing, and one thing comes up again and again. Projects that should have taken a decade are recorded as finished in 2 years. Tunnels through hard rock, cut with hand drills and black powder, at rates that modern engineers with dynamite and machines would struggle to match. Structures attributed to a company that, on paper, existed for 18 months and employed a few hundred men. You are asked to believe that a small crew with primitive tools, working in a wet mountain, cut a mile of tunnel through rock in a time frame that simply does not add up to the tools and the hands available, unless the tunnel was already partly there. Unless they were not always cutting new rock, but clearing and connecting and taking credit for passages and chambers that were already in the mountain when they arrived. Sit with that, because it changes everything. The revisionist reading of this whole period is not that these men were frauds or that they did no work. They worked, and they died, and I will not take that from them. The reading is that a great deal of the infrastructure this country credits to the industrial age was not built from nothing in the 1800s. It was inherited, rediscovered, repurposed. Sitting in the ground, in the mountains, under the mud, older than anyone was willing to say, and the men with money understood very quickly that the fortune was not just in the coal. The fortune was in controlling the story of who put it all there. Because think about what it is worth. That story. If the nation built everything itself, from nothing, through the free enterprise and grit of self-made men, then that story justifies everything. It justifies who owns the land. It justifies who owns the railroads and the mines and the mills. It justifies the entire arrangement of who is rich and who is poor, because the rich, in that story, earned it by building a world out of wilderness. But if the world was already there, if the infrastructure was inherited from someone else, some earlier order that got erased, then the whole justification collapses. Then the great fortunes are not the reward for building civilization. They are the reward for being first to the ruins, and ruthless enough to erase the fingerprints of whoever came before. That is the economic engine underneath every one of these buried chamber stories. Not spooky metal discs, ownership. The right to say, I built this, and therefore this is mine. And a dry, impossible, clearly older room, full of technology no one in 1889 could name, is a direct and mortal threat to that right. It is evidence, sitting in the dark, that someone was here first. So what do you do if you are the money and your crew just punched into the proof that your entire founding story is a lie? You do exactly what the records show happened next. Within days of the breakthrough, according to the fragments that survive, the character of the whole operation changed. Doyle sent word up the line, as any foreman would, reporting an obstruction and an unexpected chamber. He expected engineers. What came instead was men in good coats, not railroad engineers, not the usual company surveyors. Men who arrived quickly, which by itself is strange, because nothing arrived quickly in that country in 1889. For them to be there within days, they had to already have been close, or already have been watching, or already have known that this ridge might hold something worth watching for. The men in the good coats took over. The work crew was pulled back from the face. New guards, ones the men did not recognize, were posted at the tunnel mouth. And the chamber, which 40 men had walked into freely, was suddenly a place that ordinary workers were no longer permitted to see. This is the pattern. I want you to hold on to this pattern, because you are going to see it again and again, in story after story, across the whole country and across the whole century. Workers break through into something impossible. The moment the report goes up the chain, control comes down the chain, fast, from people the workers have never met and cannot name, and then the record goes dark. Some of the crew were paid off and dismissed, given a bonus, actually, which sounds generous until you understand what a bonus buys. A bonus buys silence, and a bonus buys distance, and a bonus sends a man down the road to another county before he has had time to tell the story too many times. Others were reassigned to a different section of line entirely, miles away. Before I go further, that document in the pinned comment. If you have not found it yet, go there now, because everything I cover in these videos is one piece of a pattern that only becomes visible when you see all 35 cases together. The document shows you the full pattern. What I can show you here is the surface. What is down there is everything underneath it. Pinned comment, now, then come back. Split up so that no two men who had stood in that chamber together were working side by side anymore. Doyle himself, the careful foreman, the one man whose word would have carried weight, disappears from the record almost completely after that summer. Not dies, disappears. The paper trail simply stops, the way a paper trail stops when someone with resources decides it should. And the tunnel. This is the part that gives me chills every time. The tunnel was rerouted. The line that was supposed to go straight through that ridge, the line they had spent 11 weeks and who knows how many lives cutting, was abandoned at that point and swung around to the south, adding cost, adding time, adding miles, for no engineering reason anyone ever wrote down. They walked away from a tunnel they had nearly finished, and the section containing the chamber was sealed, backfilled, collapsed with charges and packed with rubble until the mountain looked, from the outside, like it had never been touched at all. Ask yourself what it cost to do that, to abandon a nearly complete tunnel and build around it. That is an enormous sum of money, deliberately spent, to make a hole in a mountain go away. No company hemorrhages money like that to hide a natural cave. You spend money like that to bury something that threatens something worth even more. And the only thing worth more than a railroad, to the men who owned that railroad, was the story that justified their owning it. Remember the boy, the one who carried the water and the tools and the messages, the one nobody thought to watch. Here is the thing about a campaign of silence built to buy off hardened, experienced men. It is aimed at the people who matter, the foreman whose word carries weight, the skilled hands whose accounts a company man would take seriously. Nobody bothers very much about a water boy. A water boy is furniture. And so, in the one fragment of this whole affair that reads like a genuine first-hand voice rather than a rumour of a rumour, it is a very old man, decades later, recorded almost by accident, who says that as a boy he carried water in a Tennessee tunnel and saw them bring something out, not seal it in, bring it out. He says the men in the good coats had the disc taken from the wall, wrapped in canvas and roped onto a low wagon, and hauled out of the tunnel mouth at night, and that it took 8 men to move a thing no larger than a millstone. because it was far heavier than any stone that size had any right to be. He says the wagon went east toward the rail junction, and that he never learned where it went after that, and that a man he did not know pressed coins into his hand at the tunnel mouth and told him, kindly, the way you would warn a child off a cliff, that he had not seen anything, and that boys who saw things did not grow up to be old men. He grew up to be an old man anyway, and at the very end of it, when there was no longer anyone left to pay off or to frighten, he told what he saw, one voice, easy to dismiss. Except that his small, specific, unglamorous account, the 8 straining men, the millstone that weighed like lead, the wagon going east in the dark, does not read like the invention of a folklorist. It reads like a memory. And it tells us the most important thing of all. The thing that turns this from a story about a sealed room into a story about a theft. They did not just wall the chamber up and walk away. They took the object first. Whatever that disc was, it did not go back into the dark with the rest of the secret. It went east, on a wagon, in the night, into the hands of men who already had the shell companies and the good coats and the guards in place before the crew had even finished being surprised. Which means they were not reacting, they were collecting. Now I promised you this was not the only case, and here is where the ground really opens up under your feet. Once you know the shape of this story, the dry chamber, the impossible age, the object no one can name, the fast and faceless men who arrive to take control, the sealed and vanished site, you start finding it everywhere. Not identical, but the same skeleton, wearing different clothes, in state after state, decade after decade. There is the account from a mining operation in the mountains further south, a few years later, where a crew chasing a coal seam broke into a gallery of fitted stone that no coal company had cut, and where, the story goes, the walls were dry, and the air was clean, and the passage ran straight and level, in a way no natural fissure ever does. That mine, too, saw its records thin out. That gallery, too, was sealed. The company involved, too, dissolved and reformed under a new name with the same money behind it. There is the account from a waterworks excavation beneath a growing city, where men digging for a reservoir came down onto a paved floor, cut stone, level and joined, 20 feet below the surface. Below the layer where the city's own founders had supposedly started from bare ground. A paved floor beneath the foundations of a city that officially had no history before the men who were now digging it up. That find made the local paper for exactly 1 edition. Then nothing. Then the reservoir was built on schedule, over the top of whatever was down there, and the paved floor became a thing that a few old men would swear they had seen and that no official history would ever admit. There is the account from a quarry in the next state over, where men cutting building stone out of a hillside opened the side of a chamber whose ceiling, when they got a light up into it, was not rough rock but a dome, a true dome, curved and coursed and keyed at the top with a single central block, the kind of engineering that the men doing the cutting associated with the great banks and courthouses of the cities, not with the inside of an anonymous hill in the middle of nowhere. A dome, underground, older than the quarry, older than the county, older than the state. The quarry closed that season. The owners cited flooding, which is a bitter joke to anyone following this story, because the one thing these chambers never seem to have is water. The land changed hands twice in 18 months, and was eventually bought by an interest no local person could put a face to, and it has never been worked since. There is the account, further north, of a crew laying the foundation for a courthouse who came down through the soil onto a road. Not a modern road, a road of fitted paving stones, running straight, disappearing under the earth in both directions, at a depth that the official history of that town could not explain, because the official history of that town began with a surveyor and a stake and an empty field, and there is no empty field with a paved road already buried under it. The men were told to break it up and build over it, and they did, because men who want to keep their wages do what they are told, and the courthouse stands on top of it to this day, and the people who go in and out of that building to settle their small legal matters have no idea that they are walking above the road of a civilization that the law inside that building does not officially admit ever existed. The pattern holds, dry where it should be wet, straight where it should be broken, old where it should be new, present where the official story says there was nothing but wilderness and then us, and every single time the same economic response. Not curiosity, not science, containment. Fast, expensive, professional containment, followed by silence, followed by the smooth and confident retelling of the story in which none of it ever happened and we built it all ourselves. Why? Keep asking why, because the why is the whole thing. If you are a scientist and your crew finds an impossible dry chamber with a warm metal disc inside it, you study it, you bring in more people, you publish, you become famous. That is what curiosity does. But that is not what happened, not in a single one of these cases. What happened was the opposite of curiosity. What happened was a reflex, fast and coordinated and well-funded, to make the discovery disappear. And a reflex like that does not come from scientists. It comes from owners. It comes from the specific, narrow, ferocious interest of the people whose wealth and whose legitimacy depend on a particular story being the only story anyone is ever allowed to tell. Let me put it in the plainest terms I can. Suppose you have just borrowed enormous sums from banks in New York and London to build a railroad on the promise that you are opening up a virgin wilderness. Suppose your land grants, the free land the government handed you along your right-of-way, were justified by the claim that you were bringing civilization to an empty country. Now, suppose your own crew punches into hard proof that the country was not empty, that there was infrastructure here before you, fitted stone, sealed chambers, technology. What does that do to your loans? What does that do to your land titles? What does that do to the tidy legal fiction that you can own something because you were the one who improved wild and unclaimed ground? And it is worse than embarrassment, because the whole enterprise was financed against that empty wilderness. Understand how railroad money actually worked. These lines were not built out of profits. They were built out of debt and out of land. The government handed the railroad companies vast checkerboards of public land along their routes, free, on the theory that they were bringing value to worthless empty ground. The companies then borrowed against that land, sold bonds against it, mortgaged the future against the promise that they were the origin of all the value in it. Every dollar of that financing rested on a single load-bearing lie, that the ground was empty and became valuable only because they arrived. Now drop a fitted stone chamber into the middle of that. Drop a paved road, a dome, a sealed vault of unknown technology into ground you have already told the bond market was virgin wilderness. You have not just found an artifact. You have found a defect in the title to everything you own and everything you have borrowed against. You have found the one fact that, if it spread, could unwind the loans, void the grants, and turn the richest men in the region into the operators of a colossal fraud. There is even the matter of insurance and salvage, which sounds dull until you see what it means. Under the law, if you improve unclaimed land, the improvement is yours. But if there was a prior owner, a prior builder, a prior civilization whose works you are merely occupying, then in principle you are not an improver at all. You are a trespasser on someone else's estate, however long dead they are, and the entire legal scaffolding that lets a man say this mountain is mine because I cut a tunnel through it starts to look like what it may always have been. A claim of finders keepers, filed over a graveyard, backed by guns and lawyers, and a story so well told that the descendants of the finders now believe it as gospel. That is the exposure. That is what a dry room threatens, not a company's dignity, its deeds. It does not just embarrass you, it exposes you. It turns your entire enterprise from heroic development into something that looks a great deal more like looting a graveyard and filing a deed on it. And men do not let that kind of exposure stand. They spend whatever it takes to bury it. Literally, in the case of that Tennessee ridge, with charges and rubble and a rerouted line. This is what I mean when I say this is economic history, not ghost story. The disc in the wall is the least of it. The disc is just the thing that made these men afraid. The real story is the machinery of fear and money that closed around that disc the moment it came to light, and the way that same machinery has closed around every similar find, and the way it left us with a history that is confident and detailed and beautifully told, and wrong at the root. Because here is what the pattern is really telling you, if you follow it all the way down. It is not telling you that there was one weird room in one Tennessee mountain. It is telling you that beneath the official history of the industrial age there is the outline of an earlier one, an order that built in fitted stone, that waterproofed chambers deep in wet rock, that set objects of unknown purpose into the walls of rooms and sealed them to wait, an order that was, by the time the railroad men found its bones, already gone, already erased, already so thoroughly forgotten that its own works were mistaken for empty wilderness by the people who came to strip them. What erased it? That is the question at the bottom of the well, and I will be honest, it is the question where the solid ground runs out and we are left holding fragments and inference. But the fragments are suggestive. Across these accounts, and 100 others like them, there are recurring hints of some great discontinuity. A break. A layer in the earth, in city after city, where the old and the new do not meet gently but are separated by a band of mud and rubble, as though something swept through and buried a world in a single stroke, and the survivors, or the newcomers, built on top of the wreckage without ever understanding, or ever admitting, what was underneath. You have heard the tidy name for the layer they blame it on. Fill, grading, the natural raising of city streets over time, and sometimes, sure, that is all it is. But sometimes the fill is 20 feet deep and arrives all at once and covers the ground floors of buildings that were clearly meant to have their front doors at that lower level. Sometimes what the official story calls the natural rise of a city looks, to an honest eye, a great deal more like the aftermath of a burial. Whole first stories of grand stone buildings, now basements, now below grade, entered by stairs that go down to doorways built to open at the level of a street that no longer exists. You are told the people of the 1800s simply chose to build their beautiful ground floors underground. Ask yourself if that is what you would do, and once you have seen it in one place, you cannot stop seeing it. The grand old buildings with their finest stonework and their most beautiful arched windows now sitting half below the sidewalk, their lower floors turned into basements, their original entrances buried. The canals and waterworks in cities that supposedly had no engineers yet, laid out with a precision the official founders could not have managed. The star-shaped fortifications and the vast masonry foundations that show up in the earliest photographs of a place, already old, already weathered, already there, in the very images that are supposed to document the beginning. You are told, every time, a small and reasonable-sounding explanation. The street was raised for drainage. The style was a fashion. The building was older than we thought by a decade or two, no more, and any one of those explanations, on its own, holds. That is the trick of it. Each individual lie is small and plausible. It is only when you lay them side by side, 1,000 small plausible explanations all pointing the same direction, all quietly accounting for the same buried older world, that you realize you are not looking at 1,000 coincidences. You are looking at a single enormous fact that has been broken into 1,000 harmless pieces so that no one has to look at the whole of it at once. What could bury a world like that, all at once? Deep enough to turn ground floors into cellars and roads into buried roads and whole chambers into sealed pockets in the rock? The honest answer is that we are not sure, and the people who might have known made certain we would not. Some point to a flood of mud and water on a scale we have no modern memory of, a single catastrophic event that swept a layer of the earth over everything and left the survivors, or the newcomers, to build on top of the wreck. Others suspect something slower and stranger, a discontinuity, a break in the record so complete that the people on the far side of it genuinely did not know what they had inherited. I am not going to pretend to settle that here. What I will tell you is that the dry chamber fits either way, because a room sealed and waterproof before the burial, a room built by people who knew what was coming, or who simply built to last beyond anything we build to last, would survive exactly like this, dry, intact, waiting. An air pocket of the old world, sealed off, riding out the burial of everything around it, until a crew with black powder happened to punch through the wall by accident and let the light of 1,889 fall on something that had been in the dark since before 1889 had a name. I am not going to stand here and tell you I know exactly what happened, because I do not, and anyone who claims perfect certainty about the deep past is selling you something. What I am telling you is that the official story has holes in it big enough to drive a train through, and that the men who profited most from that story spent extraordinary sums making sure you never noticed the holes. And when I find a dry room in a wet mountain, with a warm object in the wall, sealed shut by frightened men with good coats and deep pockets, I do not think tall tale any more. I think somebody was here first, and somebody very much did not want that known. Let me come back to the crew, because they deserve better than to be a footnote in someone else's cover story. Think about those 40 men. They spent 11 weeks in cold water, in the dark, breathing powder smoke, dying by inches the way tunnel men died, so that iron rails could carry someone else's coal to someone else's fortune. And in the 11th week, they broke through into the single most extraordinary thing any of them would ever see. A dry room in a wet mountain. Proof, standing right in front of their lanterns, that the world was older and stranger than any preacher or schoolteacher had ever told them. For a few hours, 40 ordinary working men knew a secret that could have rewritten the history of the continent. And then the men in the good coats came, and the money did its quiet work, and those 40 men were scattered to the wind, paid off, reassigned, split up, sent down the road with a bonus in their pocket and a warning behind their eyes. Some of them, I have no doubt, told the story anyway, in kitchens and in bar rooms and on porches on summer nights, to children and grandchildren who half believed it and mostly did not. And the story got smaller with each telling, and stranger and easier to dismiss, until it was just another piece of mountain folklore, the kind of thing you smile at and forget, which is precisely what it was designed to become. The most effective way to bury a truth is not to silence it completely. It is to let it survive only as a tale too wild to take seriously. That is the genius of the thing, and the horror of it. They did not have to burn every record. They just had to make sure that the ones who saw were poor and scattered and disbelieved. They just had to control the version that got written down, the official one, the one with the citations and the bronze plaques and the confident tone, and they did. They controlled it so completely that 130 years later, the default reaction to a story like this one is a smirk. That smirk is not skepticism. That smirk was installed. It was paid for. It is the finished product of a very long and very expensive campaign to make sure that when someone finally pulls the thread, everyone around them laughs instead of listens. And here is the cruelest part of the design. The men who built that smirk into you did not have to convince you of anything. They only had to make the truth feel embarrassing to say out loud. That is cheaper than force, and it lasts longer than any guard at a tunnel mouth. A guard dies. A shell company dissolves. But a reflex of shame, planted deep enough, passed down from parent to child as common sense, guards a secret for free, forever, with no one even aware they are standing watch. You have been standing watch over this your whole life and never knew it. The moment you felt the urge to roll your eyes at a dry room in a wet mountain, you were doing unpaid labor for men who have been dead for 100 years, protecting a fortune that was never yours and a story that was never true. I want to give the skeptics their due, because I am not asking you to switch off your mind. I am asking you to switch it all the way on. The reasonable objection goes like this. These are old stories, poorly documented, told by uneducated men, embellished over generations, and there is no chamber you can go visit and no disc you can put your hands on. So how is any of this different from a ghost story? And that is fair. On its own, one account proves nothing. I will say that plainly. If the Tennessee Ridge were the only case, I would not be talking to you about it. But the skeptic has to explain the pattern, and this is where the easy dismissal falls apart. It is not one story. It is the same story, with the same structure, appearing independently across huge distances and long stretches of time, told by people who never met and had no way to coordinate. Dry where it should be wet, fitted stone where there should be raw rock, an object that does not belong, and then, every single time, the same economic reflex, the fast arrival of moneyed strangers, the scattering of the crew, the sealing of the site, the thinning of the records, the company that dissolves and reforms. When the same fingerprints show up at scene after scene after scene, at some point you have to stop calling it coincidence and start asking who has hands that shape. And notice what the standard explanations conveniently leave out. They can explain a cave. They cannot explain why the cave was dry. They can explain a legend, They cannot explain why the legend always comes attached to a real, documented rerouting of a real, documented rail line at real, documented, ruinous cost. The folklore explanation accounts for the disc and ignores the money. But the money is the part that is actually in the records, or that is conspicuously torn out of them. The money is the hard evidence, and the money says that somebody, repeatedly, spent enormous sums to make impossible discoveries disappear. Legends do not cost anything to sustain. Cover-ups do. Somebody was paying. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a choice about what kind of history we are willing to believe. You can hold on to the tidy version, the one where the land was empty and the men were giants and everything you see around you was conjured out of raw wilderness in a single heroic generation by the free and grinning genius of the market. It is a comfortable story. It flatters everyone still standing at the top of the arrangement it justifies, and it has the enormous advantage of being the one printed in every book you were handed as a child. Or you can look at the dry room, and the sealed mine gallery, and the paved floor under the reservoir, and the buried ground floors of 100 grand old buildings that were somehow, we are told, built underground on purpose. And you can notice that every one of these things points the same direction, toward an older order that was here first and was erased, and toward a newer order that got fabulously rich building on the bones of it and rewriting the deed. You can notice that the erasing was not an accident of time but an active, funded, ongoing project, and that the smirk you feel rising in you right now is part of that project, doing its job right on schedule. I am not going to tell you which to believe. I am going to tell you what that crew saw, as best as it comes down to us, and then I am going to step back and let you sit with the size of it. They saw a wall of fitted stone inside a mountain that officially held nothing but rock. They saw a room that stayed dry where every law of that wet country said it should have drowned. They saw an object of dark, faintly warm metal, marked with lines too fine for any tool they knew, set into a niche and sealed to wait. They saw for a few hours in the summer of 1889 the edge of a truth so large it would have swallowed the whole official story of the age. And then they watched moneyed strangers take it away, and seal it up, and pay them to forget, and reroute a railroad around a hole in a mountain rather than let the world look inside. The ridge is still there. The rerouted line, or what is left of it, still swings its strange, unnecessary curve to the south for no reason any engineer ever wrote down. And somewhere behind the rubble and the backfill, in the dark, in the dry, the room is presumably still waiting, exactly as it was, with the warm thing still set in the wall, patient as it has always been, on the far side of a silence that cost a fortune to buy. They told you the land was empty. They told you it started with them. They spent more money than you will ever see, making sure you never ask the one question that brings the whole thing down. Who was here first? And why were the men who profited from forgetting them so very, very afraid of a dry room in a wet mountain? Think about that the next time you ride through a tunnel someone assures you was cut by hand in an afternoon. Think about the water that should be there and is not. Think about the stories that got small so that certain fortunes could stay large. And ask yourself, honestly, whether the history you were handed is the record of what happened, or just the version that the winners of a much older and much darker contest could afford to have written down. Because the room is still bone dry, and the men who buried it are long dead, while the thing they feared sits warm and patient in the dark, and the record is still missing. And somewhere in the folded rock of eastern Tennessee, a truth that 40 working men once held in their hands for a single afternoon is still sitting in the dark, still waiting for someone with the nerve to stop smirking and start digging.